morning, we continue a sermon series conversation we started a couple of weeks ago. And we're actually going to get to the series within the series. It's a 6-week series, but 3 weeks of it are just to interpret a drawing that we tried to put out there to help give us a scope of what a whole life before God might look like, and the grooves that we tend to take as followers of Jesus. And so a couple weeks ago, I talked about shrunken stories, about how sometimes we're tempted to be held captive by a story that's too small in order to be God's story for us. And so there's this invitation to leave the shrunken story behind and to discover our name and our way again. And then last week, we talked about necessary losses, because at some point in life, no matter how clever and how gifted we are, we experience losses, and those losses don't have to be seen as a detriment, but as a way moving forward. And so now we could actually get to the interpretation of these drawings. So I threw these drawings up a few weeks ago, and I didn't give any explanation to them, and they look a little bit, tedious, ludicrous at this point, because there's no explanation behind them. But you'll notice in the top left corner, and Ben Knox saw this, and he sent me a text message this week. He said, it looks like one's a masculine journey and one's a female journey, and he was correct. But then he gave me a drawing of a map of how women shop in a store and how men shop in a store, and I thought, that's pretty clever, but that's not the same drawing as this one up here. But what I'm going to suggest is that each of us, think of a water park with an opening of 2 water slides side by side, and all you see is the opening, and all you see is that you kind of shoot through some tubes, and then they begin to go all over the place. That there's a couple different journeys that the soul goes on throughout one's life. And what I've seen by experience, both my own life and my peers' life, but also as a pastor, there's a couple different trajectories that we go, and it's good to know the direction we're going and where we're headed so that we can be faithful and attentive to what God would try to communicate to us. And so we're going to talk about the first third of those 2 different trajectories this morning, the masculine soul and the feminine soul. And so here's just a bit of an opening of how that's going to go. You'll notice that the masculine journey on the left has a bit of a climb in its beginning, and you'll notice that the first third of the female journey, the feminine journey, is a descent in its first third of its own journey. But before we get there, I need to go to NACHO LIBRE first. Last week, I was able to initiate my kids into the vital experience of watching NACHO LIBRE. Who has seen? Yes, we're getting claps. I think it was Jim Williams. I see that clap. So how many of y'all seen NACHO LIBRE? It's off Netflix, but it is on Amazon Prime. You're welcome if you want to see it this afternoon. And we had a great time together. I wish you could see Ezra Skillen in the last wrestling match with Nacho and Ramses. He was bouncing on the couch in excitement as Nacho was wrestling Ramses finally. But the plot is a really interesting plot. I think it's really informative, actually. You have a young man who his parents were those who worked for the Lord, and they passed away, so he was now an orphan in an orphanage, but he's not as young as the rest of the orphans, and he's emerging into adulthood, but he still hasn't figured out who he is. He's got a split self. One of his sides of his self is this wanting to do the Lord's work, and he knows a lot of stuff about the gospel too. He cooks for the kids every day, and he tries his best to do the deeds of the church. But he also has this ache inside that he wants to be a luchador, a wrestler. But the leaders of the orphanage and the monastery have said, under no circumstance should you be a luchador and work for the church. And so for the whole rest of the movie, he's trying to sort out, who am I? Am I the one who works for the church, or am I a luchador that's in the ring? And he tries to figure it out by the end. I think this question of who I am is something that we all wrestle with, particularly in the first third of life. We begin to try to put our experiences together. We try to listen to our parents' instruction. We take some affirmation and some critique from coaches and from teachers, and so we put all that together. And by the time we try to emerge into adulthood, we try to put an identity and a self together. But sometimes it's challenging still. Unlike primitive cultures, our modern culture does not have a mechanism to say, you have now journeyed from childhood to adulthood. At least in primitive cultures, you go out into the wilderness, you do some elaborate process and ritual out there, and when you came back into the village, you were marked out as an adult and not a child any longer. We simply don't have a uniform process of doing that in our culture. Some say it's 16 when you're able to drive. Did anyone else feel like an adult when you got your car at 16? I didn't even know what car insurance was, and I was driving a car around, okay? Some say 18 years old because you can vote or you have other different liberties and freedoms. But let me tell you, the first time that I voted, I didn't know half the people and what they were even doing in the midst of that ballot. And some of you still agree with me. You have no idea what a third of these people are even trying to run for office for. So I feel like I was making major decisions, but I didn't know exactly what for. Some say when you're 21 years old, you get more freedoms, more liberties. Perhaps that's when you're an adult, but it's still not certain. In fact, sociologists are suggesting that adolescence, which is a term that we've created, this middle ground between childhood and adulthood, is extending to the age of 30, maybe even into 35 in modern culture. And some of you are trying not to look at your adult children who are, who are still trying to figure it out and try to give them some guilty stares or something this morning. And this is an issue in our culture. How do we know when we've crossed from the first third of life into the second third of life where we're producing and people can count on us? So I came into some material. There's actually a stat out there that 1.8 billion young adults are on the cusp of adulthood, and they're asking the question, who am I? And how do I know if I found my place? A Band of Brothers, which is a nonprofit that's reaching out to gang members, teenage gang members in the UK, this is what they say about the need and necessity of these marked out experiences. They say, if the fires that innately burn inside young men are not intentionally and lovingly added to the hearth of community, they will burn down the structures of culture. And I highlight a couple words there, intentionally and lovingly. I think we have to agree that if we just allow a soul to meander on its own, it may or may not find its rightful place. And so as the church, we have some questions to ask. Do we have an intentional process, at least a pathway forward, to help our young people figure out what it means to be an adult and a Christian that's in the life of the church? But secondly, it's lovingly. We can't belittle young people into proper living. We can't send them meme after meme and comment of disgust after comment of disgust, and that will somehow they'll wake up and say, gee, I'm so glad I got chewed out again today. I'm going to go ahead and get my act together. I mean, that's not how it works. So is there a loving process, particularly in the name of the love of Jesus Christ, that we can lead young people into the space where they're now in the second, third of life? Tom Lott, who's a journalist, he's talking about his own experience as a parent and what he sees in wider culture, and this need for this initiation rite, this need for a pathway forward for our kids marked out. He says this: the fundamental need to have our passages in life marked cannot be erased. Slap on the veneer of civilization as much as you like and blur the line between male and female as much as you find convenient, but these urges remain within us and need somehow to be addressed, not just privately, but at a wider level. Can we as a system, as a community, help lead our young people forward? The joy that we have as a church is that this has been one of our vocations from the very beginning. The church has always included the young. They've made much of young people in each and every local church community, and we've fussed over them, and we've tried to teach them the way of Jesus as early as possible, the practices of the faith, and how they might take some leadership positions in the life of the church. This is who we are, and so what an amazing moment that as the wider culture is asking, how do we help our young people find the fire that's burning within them into the hearth of community? The church for 2,000 years has said, come follow us as we follow Christ. But that still begs a few questions. What does that look like? What does that look like for the young men and the young women in our community? Richard Rohr says this in general: there's two halves of life. There's two great tasks of life. The first one is to build a strong container or an identity. The second is to find the contents that the container was meant to hold. The first half of life, Richard Rohr suggests, is where you figure out who you are. You go to school, you pick a major, you pick an occupation, you pick a partner, you start to have children, you pick a neighborhood to live in. You make all these huge choices that make major decisions for you in regards to where you're going to be and where you're going to live and what you're going to do. But that's not the only task. The second half of life, there's a gear change where now we begin to try to fill that container with the most meaning as we can as possible. So these different stories begin to name us. As we're asking, who am I? Some of these decisions we make or that are made for us, they help us to build that first container in the first half of life. And sometimes these are official things. Sometimes these are like mundane and subtle things. I remember a couple things that I still remember from my childhood that inform who I am today. My dad took my brothers and I, the three of us, to Disney World when we were younger, and he didn't want us to bother him all day long. So at the beginning of the day, he gave us $10. And he said, you can spend this on whatever you want. $10 was like a windfall to any of us in the Skillen household. Dad is an accountant, and he's a pretty frugal man himself. So anytime he gave you that much money, this is a big deal. It's like monumental. And so my brother Matt found a bongo set at the beginning of the day, and he regretted it because he had to carry those bongos the rest of the time at Disney World. And my younger brother Steve, he found a bunch of candy and snacks to eat throughout the day because he has a sweet tooth. And Dad said, I'll never forget it, you kept your $10 and you didn't spend any of it. He says, that marked you out. It made me convinced you're more like me than your brothers in this area of your life. And so from the very beginning, I was named as this frugal person, someone who pinches pennies. And I'm married to a person who does so much copious research on every decision that we have to make financially. You should see Ginger's desktop. When she opens a web browser, there's 10 different tabs for the same item. And even I'm annoyed, as a frugal person, but just make a decision. It's going to be totally okay, right? So that was one experience that marks me out. Like, it still has shaped who I am in my container. A second one is my stepmom one day, she told me this peculiar thing. We were driving down the road one day, and I think she was just trying to fill the time. But she said, you're different than your brothers in a way. You don't let things bother you. She gave me this metaphor. She's like, you're kind of like a duck where water rolls over its back and off the back, and it doesn't stick to it. She's like, I feel like no matter the difficulty that you face or the uncertainty that's ahead, you never seem rattled. You always seem calm. Now, I would love to tell you that that's who I am every day. I wouldn't have chose pastoral ministry if I was going to be like that every day. Can I hear an amen? Okay. But there's something that calls out to me in times of anxiety when I'm fretting about something small. My stepmom's voice speaks to me deep within. She says, no, let this roll off your back. Move ahead. Move past this. But it does me no good to build this container and to have all these things that I've decided, but not also go in the process of seeking to fill that container. It's one thing to be frugal and to be a person who has little to no anxiety. It's another thing to go do something with that. And so perhaps what we do in the first third of life is we build the container, but then we go on search of how to fill it with meaning and purpose. So what we're going to do this morning is look at the first third drawings. And what we're going to do is we're going to trace the life of Jacob for the masculine journey, and we're going to trace the life of Naomi for the feminine journey. And we're all going to get through the first third of their story. We're going to leave you on a to be continued today. So come back in the next couple of weeks to help finish their story. But it seems like the masculine journey is structured on purpose and on a challenge. And we see that in the life of Jacob. Even before he's born, he's got a great governing purpose. He's one of two twins, and Rebecca's having some heartburn one night. She's wondering what's going on with these two boys inside of her because they're constantly wrestling, and God speaks to her in the middle of Genesis chapter 25, verse 23, and God gives a framework to what's going on and some foreshadowing of their experience together. The Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other. The older will serve the younger. Now let's just stop there for a moment. The idea that the older son would serve the younger son would have been a ridiculous idea in this culture. In fact, who's the firstborn in there? Any firstborns in the room? Raise your hand high. If you can find Doc Brown's DeLorean, you would love to go back to this time. Because if there were like 7 sons in your family, and once your father passed away, they would take all the net worth of your father, they would split it 8 ways, and you would get 2 times the amount of the rest of your brothers. So you're definitely living in the wrong era right now if you're a firstborn. But the fact that the younger would serve the older was impossible to imagine. And so from the first day, Rebecca and Jacob begin to go on a journey. How can we make this so? How can we find opportunities for Jacob to overcome Esau? Well, one of those first things happens early in his story when Jacob is cooking in the kitchen, and his brother's been hunting in the field all day, and his brother is famished. And so he comes in, and he feels like he's going to die unless he gets a bowl of stew. And so Jacob says, I'll give you this bowl of red stew if you give me your birthright. That's kind of a weird request, right? But Esau takes him up on it. But since Dad's not in the room, it doesn't seem to really count. So when Dad's dying and his vision is becoming weaker and weaker, Jacob dresses up like his brother Esau, and he slips into his dad's tent, and he gets Esau's blessing instead of his own. And his father declares that the older will serve the younger. He's gone on the climb. He's found his challenge. He's climbed the highest peak, and he's proven to be the one who's able to be on top. And that is the first third of the male journey, the masculine journey. We tell our young masculine souls to go out there and achieve something, to build something, to create something, to defend something, to honor something. The first third of their life is shaped by what Richard Rohr calls the heroic journey. Go be big, be noticed, outlast the rest, be the first one to the finish line. And that helps to shape who we are, both in the victories and the defeats of that heroic journey. By the time we're 30 years old, we get to the apex, the very top, and we have a picture of who we're going to be, what we're good at, what our gifts are. But that sets us up for the second part of the journey that we're going to learn about next week when we begin the functional descent that happens in the masculine journey. But I want to focus on this red arrow that points downward halfway up the heroic journey. It's called the angry young man. To the masculine soul who does not get a chance to try to know his power, he turns into the angry young man. To the parents who overprotect, to the parents who prevent any danger in this young person's life, or to try, or to get out there and risk something, what we're finding again and again in social context is that if a young masculine soul doesn't get a chance to see what he's worth, he turns into an angry young man. And he begins to point that anger to vulnerable things in the second part of his journey. So for the parents in the room who are raising young masculine souls, it is okay for them to climb the tallest of trees. It is okay for them to come home and say, I want to try out for the play. It's a musical and I've never sung before, and to allow them to try their best. It is great for them to come up with elaborate dreams and try to act them out. This is something that helps to shape their soul for the second part ahead. And to prevent them, to overprotect them, is to take something vital out of their hands that's necessary for their journey. And we see this in Jacob's life. He climbs, he scrapes, he trips up, he deceives, and finally he gets on top. But the irony is that he has everything in his hands. He's got the birthright, but he has to leave home because his other brother wants to end his life. And so Jacob is on a journey away. He's got the birthright. He's got the pathway to the throne, more or less, but he's got to go hide. And as he's walking away and trying to sort this out, wondering what his next move is going to be, God shows up and God speaks to him definitively. We see in Genesis chapter 28, verses 12 through 15, where God promises to be with him. God says, I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until you have done what I have promised. But I imagine as Jacob is hearing this for the first time and amazed to hearing the voice of his Creator and trying to project what his life is going to be like now, he never would have expected that his life would have ended the way that it did. But nevertheless, through the twists and the turns, God is with him in the victories and also in the defeats. But the reason he lands where he lands later in life is because his first third of life, he was given the chance to climb. And so here we leave Jacob's story as he begins to wander to Padam Aram, where his mother's extended family lives, in order to make sense of the second third of his life. So let's turn to the feminine journey now. This is Naomi's journey. You'll notice that in the drawing for the masculine journey, we go up in a heroic journey, but in the feminine journey, it's a descent at first. Because in both ancient cultures and current cultures, we have a hard time helping young women find an identity before they're in their 20s, 30s, 40s, to where they have a family or an occupation. They're a group of people that are in waiting until something more clear happens later in life. And so they go on this descent for the first 20 years of life, and sure, they've got perhaps a good upbringing, a lot of friends, and a lot of experiences. But when it comes to answering the question, who are you, there's always this pause. There's this delay. There's this, I'm not quite sure yet. And so Richard Rohr suggests that by the time a young feminine soul is 20 years old or thereabouts, they need to have a permeable self-identity, one that's pliable, one that can be shaped a bit further by future experiences. It doesn't have to be as solid as the masculine journey, but they have to have something. Because if they have nothing, they will continue their descent. We see in the red arrow downwards what Richard Rohr calls the young fool. This is the feminine soul who has no idea who she is. And she tries to find who she is in many different types of relationships, thinking that her identity is somehow buried in somebody else's identity. So it's a marriage, it's kids, it's an occupation, it's even the latest gossip at work, or even reality TV. It's like the greatest thing in the world to them, because deep inside they have nothing to say is their own identity. And so they have to try to find a way to find it in another. And so they continue to descend, to barely have a foundation, and to wonder, when is it going to be their chance to be able to answer who they are? And there's a danger there. And so what we can do as we lead the young feminine soul is to ask them as early as possible, who are you? What is it that makes you come alive and sets you apart from the rest of the people that are in your friends group? What makes you, you? But we see this descent in Naomi's life. We'll notice in the first 5 verses of Ruth, we get the plot, and it's really thick. Naomi's married to her husband, and she's got 2 sons, and they're from Bethlehem, but Bethlehem's having a severe famine, and so they go to a neighboring community, the Moabites, where good Jewish people don't go to live. And so while they're there, she marries off her 2 sons to 2 Moabite women, and disaster comes to her household. Her husband dies, and her 2 sons die, and she has to return home to try to find food and survival. And she tries to tell her daughters-in-law to go back to their families, but Ruth decides to stay with her. But imagine the turmoil within her as she goes back to Bethlehem. She's just broken some social rules. You're not supposed to be a chosen people of God and go to a neighboring country and spend time there. You're not supposed to marry your sons off to foreign women. And so here she is. As she walks into the community, people begin to chatter. There's some gossip going around the watering hole, and people begin to say, isn't this Naomi? And they're not saying it to gather information. They're saying it in a form of ridicule. And as she enters into Bethlehem, this is what she says in verses 20 and 21. Do not call me Naomi, she told them. Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune to me. Notice her descent. She had this identity. She was named, but her life is caved in. And she no longer wants to be referred to as the first thing that she was named. She's on search for a different identity if God would have mercy on her out there. But the redemptive part of her story is that Ruth, this outsider who barely knows her, who was just married to her son, actually decides to stick with her. Who wants to say to Naomi, yeah, sure, your husband has died and your sons have died. It seems like you're kind of walking around with a curse over your head like a dark cloud, but I still love you, and wherever you go, I will go, and I will make your people my people. There's a bit of redemption at the very dark part of this, early part of this story, and it only goes up from here. Now, we might be looking at this drawing, and we might be saying, man, it's tough to be in the feminine journey because your life starts out with so much uncertainty. But towards the end of the drawing, I want us just to hold on for the next 2 weeks, because in the drawing itself, the feminine soul takes a great lift and goes on a great ascent towards the second half of life, and it's beautiful. Richard Rohr says this, actually having a descent early is important because people with this journey learn the way of loss and grace and redemption that people on the other journey don't go on. You'll notice that in the Gospels, when Jesus is interacting with his male disciples, he says, take up your cross, learn to die. And they're like, you're not really saying that to me. You're saying that to the guy next to me, right? I don't want to die. I don't want to go back down. But to the women, he's always saying, trust yourself. Go back and share the news. He's lifting them in the story again and again and again. So the descent is hard at first, but it gives way to a great climb towards the end of the story. But the question that we have as we look at these first 2 drawings, the first third of life, is what are we supposed to do? I've got each of these in my household. I'm married to one. Our kids seem to be going in different directions. How do we make sense of how this works in the first third of life? How can the church respond to this complex and chaotic situation in the first third of life? This brings me back to NACHO LIBRE, believe it or not. So the whole film, he's trying to decide, am I supposed to work in the church? Am I supposed to wrestle? I feel love for both of them. Is there a way to merge the two together? An interesting trope in this story is that the wrestlers in this community, they always wear their mask. Even when they're just out walking around getting groceries, they're wearing the mask. It's almost like they're not really living a life, they're playing a part. They're shallow people. Sure, people are chanting their names and they're coming to the ring to watch them wrestle, but don't you feel sorry for them if you have to walk around with a mask on for every other hour of your life? A powerful point of the story happens when NACHO's mask is torn off in the middle of the ring, and that's when he discovers who he really is. He becomes a better wrestler, becomes better at the work of the church. He finds out his true meaning and existence, and I wonder if this is not a helpful way forward. Perhaps what we should do for the first third of life and for those in our life that are in that space is to help them not wear masks. Because let's be honest, as I've been a Christian and as I've experienced a faith life myself, as I've led in churches, we tend to allow our children to have multiple selves. A school self, a sports self, an extracurricular self, and a church self. They know how to play a religious game. And even though we read in the scriptures where Jesus says, I'm coming to take all, if you want to follow me, you must take up your cross daily and follow me. We teach our kids to say, yes, I want to follow Jesus, but they cross their fingers behind their back. They know how to play the game within the community. But once they're away, they can do whatever they like and wear a different mask. And they don't have a whole self. Perhaps what we could do the most for those of our kids, for raising kids, and for those of us who are students in the first third of life, is to learn to have Jesus at the center of who we are and to stop wearing masks, stop playing games, stop playing parts, and start living a life, the abundant life that Jesus calls us to. As I've walked in the church for all these years, and I've walked with those who've done the first third of life well, I've got a few different parameters that I would encourage us to do. If you're raising a first thirder, if you're a first thirder yourself, these are some things that I would want you to go on. The first one is this, I want you to learn the songs of faith. Every first thirder who has an inspiring faith, if it was in the youth group that I grew up in, or the college that I attended, or the young adults that I pastored in later parts, or in the churches before I came to Advent, is that they love to sing and to worship God. They were here on Sunday mornings, and they weren't just kind of filling up time during the song time to like check email and Facebook and all that stuff, but they were singing as loud as possible. And something happens when we sing the songs of faith. We want to go do stuff for Jesus too. And so my encouragement, we're in the middle of Memphis. This is a music town. May we have the reputation that we have young people who love to sing the songs of faith. Sure, we're Presbyterians, and we don't want to get too out of control. But I don't care about that. Do you care about that? Like, why don't we learn to sing the songs loudly and with enthusiasm and with passion? I'm longing for the day that we sing too long and I can't preach sermons, occasional Sunday or two. So first thirders, learn to sing the songs of faith. Number 2, teach generous rhythms. One of the things that dogs and plagues the development of first thirders is occupation of self and self-needs. And so if we can teach them the joy of giving away, it'll set them up for a glorious faith life. Jesus says it is more blessed to give than it is to receive. That sounds ridiculous until you actually give instead of receive. So as a family, is there something that you're donating to? Are there tangible ways in which you're giving from yourself to others? A project that you're engaging as a family or as a household? Teaching our kids the joy of giving things away. The third one is to sign them up for everything. I had a pastor once tell me the best way to raise teenagers is to keep them broke and busy. And what better way to keep them busy than the life of the church? There are a lot of things going on in the life of the church, not just in student ministry, but in this church. And what I find sometimes we raise kids, they have all these different selves and all these different compartments for all the different things of their life. And church oftentimes gets the remainder of time and not the best energy of time. So sometimes what happens if we raise kids that way, where they get the picture that church gets the remainder of my attention, they will grow up into young adulthood, into early adulthood, and they'll stop showing up to worship on Sunday mornings, and we'll say, geez, I didn't raise them like that. But you know what? We actually did. We did. So sign them up. Pay their way. Encourage them to go. Give them enthusiasm for the things that our student ministry and the rest of our church is putting on as their faith is being formed in this first third of life. I encourage us to get them busy on the things of Christ. Number 4 is to ask them, who are you? We ask them a ton of questions. Where are you going and who are you doing stuff with and how are your grades? How about this? Once a week, you get around the table together and say, who are you? How have you discovered who you are in Christ this week? When were you the most spiritually alive this week? It's awkward at first. Let me just tell you, it's awkward at first. If you want me to be there for the first time, I'll be the fall guy, I'll totally do it. But what I love is, at least in the Skillen household, there are intentional times when we ask our kids, where have you seen the nearness of Christ? Where'd you feel, what was your high today? What was your low today? And they're able to articulate how they're engaging in their faith journey. So ask them deeper questions. And lastly, help gather a pocket. We're in football season, so a pocket of protection. Every quarterback has at least 5 blockers protecting them from the people who are trying to tackle them. In the same way, every first third of life person needs some adults in their life. They may try to resist you. They might try to say that you're not relevant enough and I don't get you, and you say, I don't get you. But what we need in the church is to find functional ways of adults interacting with young people. The ratio used to be 1 adult for every 5 students. Now we're finding it's 5 adults for every 1 student. Every student needs a pocket of protection. So the question I have for us is, do you know the names of our children and students at this church? Because I think sometimes what we do is we sanitize our experience in church. We've got our Sunday schools. I want to avoid them. I don't get them in their music nor their wardrobe. And they say Fortnite all the time. I don't even know what that is. So they all do my thing, and they have their thing. But that's not the way Jesus rigged this thing. Jesus rigged this thing for us to share life together. I remember with joy, there was a day when Ginger shared that her grandpa, who's 80 years old, a widow, is still helping in kids ministry. Not only that, but there was a competition one Wednesday night where they're trying to find out who could do the most push-ups. And Herb, who's 80 years old, was doing push-ups with kids in the middle of a Wednesday night program. So my question is this: when was the last time you engaged in a push-up challenge with our young people? When was the last time we embedded ourselves in their life? When was the last time we opened ourselves to be present to the first thirders in our midst?